You might have heard that you need soundproofing for your podcast to eliminate a lot of ambient noise. Do you actually need to get soundproofing? I got an answer coming up next. Thanks for watching. My name is the Shan Man, radio broadcaster, podcaster, and podcast producer. And today we're talking all about soundproofing and do you need soundproofing for your podcast room, podcast studio. Now, I know that maybe you think to yourself, I've got all this equipment and I just don't like the way things are sounding. I know that sound is it's a pretty important thing for a lot of podcasters, especially when it comes down to not having sound bouncing off of walls like what you hear inside of my home office. So I've got a couple of answers for you that I think might be able to help you make a decision on whether or not you should get soundproofing for your podcast or not. But first, I think we need to understand what soundproofing is for. Since I've been in radio for the past 18 years, I've always been in rooms that have had some type of foam or some type of sound panel or soundproofing. And of course, this is to deaden the sound that comes out of our studio. And you also have to understand that the studio that I came from, it was an old studio that had been around for it was like 25, 30 years. There was foam on the walls, and when you walked into that studio, it was a pretty dead room in terms of sound. No sound could escape really the room, but it wasn't really a super high quality sound booth. It was really just a radio booth for radio. That's all it was. Now, there are other sound booths that are out there that voiceover artists do use. And voiceover artists use soundproofing for their room. And that's in the case of reading audiobooks or reading some type of commercial for something for TV or radio. Now, you got to remember that the money that goes into creating these soundproof rooms can get quite pricey and expensive, but I'll give you some options what you can do to create a soundproof room. Before you go and you purchase anything, I need you to consider the cost that it takes to start up your podcast. Are you going to be getting equipment? Are you going to be getting a soundboard? Are you going to be getting microphones? Are you going to be getting wires? You have to consider those prices when it comes to starting up your podcast. So think about the cost of what it's going to take to just get the podcast off the ground with the equipment that you need, the necessary equipment. Second, you need to consider the style of podcast that you're going to create. Is your podcast going to be more man on the street? It's going to be recorded with an iPhone recorder, or is it going to have a microphone? And is that microphone going to be somewhere in a studio, or is it going to be in some type of room? You have to really consider what type of podcast you are going to create, because that all falls down the line of the type of philosophy that you have for your recording. Now, for my podcast, Be The Experience, it was a combination of recording in my other room over here because it was a little more dead as far as sound was concerned, or even recording inside of this office. And I know that this office has sound that bounces off the walls completely, but that is my choice. And if no one likes to hear my podcast, it's up to them. They can go ahead and not listen at all. And I really don't care if they don't listen. Really, I create the podcast for myself. I create the experience for myself when you listen to my podcast. So that's how you should think about when you create a podcast for you. And of course, you want to create a good podcast for your audience. If sound does become a problem, then you may want to take that into consideration. Now, if you do decide that you want to get soundproofing for your room, and say like this room, this is all concrete where I live. This is not drywall at all, and so the sound tends to bounce off. So if I were to go ahead and create some type of soundproofing in this room, I would probably need to get, who knows how many panels I would need to purchase, or how much foam I would need to purchase per square foot, and it can get pricey. If you look on Amazon, it can range anywhere between $35 to $60 per square foot of foam itself, just so that you can get it on the walls. Okay, now as far as getting it on the walls, you need to actually buy the glue that goes on the walls, and that can be expensive as well. So just think about that before you start making a decision in getting soundproofing for your room. At the end of the day, you might be spending anywhere between $300 to $700, maybe even $1,000 on soundproofing your room. So is it really going to be worth it, or is that going to be something that's stopping you from starting your podcast? You really got to think about that. And let me just say something about the glue. If you're going to glue anything to the walls, you have to remember that if you decide to pull that off, if you decide to move from your home, or you decide to do a remodel on the room, that glue can get, it's hard, and it's hard to get off of the walls. You have to sand it down, and it becomes quite the job. But if you're all okay with that, hey, by all means, go ahead, get soundproofing and start gluing up the walls all on your own. But I should say this about quality soundproofing rooms. Most quality soundproofing rooms are actually a big room like this, but they have another room with panels that line it. And so it's basically a room within a room. So that sound that is coming in, trying to come in, does not get in, and sound that is trying to go out doesn't actually go out. And there's typically these really heavy doors. There are these thick doors that close between the outside world and the studio so that no sound can actually get in. That does cost a lot of money. Maybe you just need to tone it down just a little bit. So let me give you a couple of alternatives to soundproofing your room, or at least deadening the sound just a little bit. Number one, you can actually go on to Amazon and you can look for an isolation shield. An isolation shield is basically it's a shield that is about a half circle and it's got foam on it, and you can put your microphone on top of it and you can speak directly into the foam and it will deaden some of that sound. Does it deaden all of the sound? No. I've used one of these before. They're okay, but I mean, they're not the best. But if that's something that you're interested in doing, by all means, you're more than welcome to buy it. However, if you get an isolation shield and you're trying to do something with a co-host or a guest, it might be a little bit hard to see the person on the other end. I would say that an isolation shield is mainly for a voiceover artist who's reading audiobooks, commercials, TV commercials, radio commercials. That is when I think you would get an isolation shield. Number two, you can just use thick blankets. I mean, there are thick blankets pretty much all over your house, I'm sure, and all you would need to do is figure out a way to hang those blankets on the walls. It would help to get like maybe an area rug if you have tile floors like I do, and that will certainly deaden a lot of the sound. There's curtains out there that are soundproofing curtains that you can purchase on Amazon that will definitely deaden the sound too. Another alternative, if you're looking for really heavy blankets that will really deaden the sound, Amazon sells, they sell moving blankets, and when I moved into this place a few years back, my movers had started using moving blankets, and they were putting it on all of the furniture, and I picked one of them up and they were really heavy, and I thought, man, these would be really good for soundproofing because it really deadened the sound whenever we were moving things into the U-Haul. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm like, this would be great for a podcast or some type of voiceover. So if you could find a way to hang them on the walls, that might be great. The only downside is that if you live in a place like where I do in Arizona, it can get a little warm if you have those blankets up in your room, and your room will get very warm, especially when you got lights and you got computers running. It will raise the temperature. Soundproofing is really all about a philosophy of how you want your podcast to sound, just like I said in the beginning. So you're going to have to decide whether or not sound is appropriate, what kind of sound is appropriate for your podcast, if you like sound bouncing off the walls, or if you're okay with it sounding as though there's ambient sound coming in and out. There are a lot of podcast editors and podcasters out there that don't like ambient sound, and I hate to tell you this, but after 18 years on radio, what goes into the microphone is what comes out of the recording, and no sound is perfect. The only perfect sound is the ones that you can make through editing. And if you ask me, podcasting is more of it could be anything that you want, but if you're doing it in I guess the vein of radio, it's going to be somewhat imperfect, especially if you're doing something like talk radio. It's definitely going to be imperfect, and that takes practice over time to make it sound as though it is professional. You may be a beginning podcaster, and there are a lot of podcasters that are starting out that visit this channel, and thank you so much for checking out the channel. If you're looking to figure out which equipment that you need to buy, I've got a quick start guide that you can go ahead and download. It's in the description down below, and it's also going to be at the end screen of this video, so you might want to check that out. So answer me this question: will you use soundproofing for your podcast? How important is soundproofing for your podcast? I'd really be interested to know if you left a comment down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. I would really appreciate it. Now that you're a little more clear on the idea of soundproofing for your podcast, let's talk a little bit about music and the type of music that you can use for your podcast. Can you use your favorite AC/DC song? Is that something that you really want to do? I don't know, man. It might be something you might want to think about. I've got a really good video that I think you should check out. It's going to be over here on your right-hand side, my left, and it's all about copyrighted music and whether or not you should be using copyrighted music for your podcast. Thanks so much for watching this week. I'll talk to you next time. Okay, this is going to be an all-new one here. Thinking about getting...